We are black and white together. We are black and white together. Soldiers in this fight. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. Soldiers in this fight. The fight for peace. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. In Salt Lake City, Joe says I am standing by my bed. They framed you on a murder charge, says Joe, but I'm dead. Says Joe, but I'm dead. The copper bosses killed you, Joe. They shot you, Joe, says I. Takes more than guns to kill a man, says Joe, I didn't die. Says Joe, I didn't die. And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, says Joe, what they can never kill went on to organize. Went on to organize. Joe Hill ain't dead, he says to me. Joe Hill ain't never died. Where working men defend their rights, Joe Hill is at their side. Joe Hill is at their side. From San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and mill, where workers strike and organize, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find Joe Hill. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. I never died, says he.
Good evening, everyone. Give me 1 second because I'm also running the tech in the background. All right, so apologies. All right, so welcome everyone. Some of y'all may have already know me from the Claudia Jones School. My name is Dante OHara. Pronouns are he, him, based in Washington, DC with the Claudia Jones School for Political Education. And I will be facilitating tonight's webinar along with my friend and comrade from Black Women Radicals, Jamie Swift. And with that being said, we are thrilled to host the third events of a webinar series held by the Claudia Jones School, Black Women Radicals, and the Paul Robeson House and Museum, titled Radical Black Women, that will pay homage to radical Black women throughout history. Tonight's event features two luminaries that I'm honored to introduce tonight, the daughter of the great Louise Thompson Patterson and William L. Patterson, MaryLouise Patterson, and Professor Keith Gilyard, for which this event is titled after his recent book, Louise Thompson Patterson, A Life of Struggle for Justice. We would also like to acknowledge the people upon whose land that the Claudia Jones School exists. This is the land of the Nacotchtank people, from which the name Anacostia is drawn. The closest surviving nation, First Nation people, are the Piscataway Nation, who holds their annual celebration in Accokeek, Maryland. And I also want to recognize, since the person who we're talking about tonight was a major anti-imperialist, internationalist organizer, and we need to recognize what is happening very close to this country, currently in Cuba and also Nicaragua and Venezuela, and the imperialist aggression against these countries by the US government currently. So I just want to recognize and show solidarity with the Cuban Revolution, the Nicaraguan Revolution, and the experiment happening in Venezuela as well. So I want to do a few housekeeping items before we get started. I will be co-facilitating this event while we also have some folks in the background moderating the chat and the YouTube live stream. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a tab for the Q&A and a chat box in which you can insert comments and questions and try to engage with the dialogue in this conversation. This will also be recorded so we can have it available for people who were not able to attend and want for future reference. So this will be available on our YouTube channel. So to start off, we will actually be playing a clip from Louis Messiah 2002 film titled Louise Thompson Patterson in Her Own Words. This is just the trailer, which is about 5 minutes, and then we will continue with the program after we play this clip. So give me a second here.
My name is Louise Thompson Patterson. I was born in Chicago, Illinois, September 9th, 1901, and moved with my mother when I was 4 years old to the far west at the time she left my father. We did not stay in Seattle very long. My mother then moved down the coast. We probably hit Northern California. When my mother joined with my stepfather, he was a Roma. The pot of gold was always in the next town, and so I never knew what it was to finish a year, and sometimes not even a semester, in one school. I can just remember the streets and children and playing and probably being called nigger. But as I grew older, I was very conscious of growing up as a loner. We had lived in Oakland, but because of the war, housing was very scarce, and to rent a house was almost impossible. So we bought a home and moved out on Bancroft Way in Berkeley shortly after I entered the university. And we remained there until I finished college in 1923, cum laude in the School of Economics. My friends that I had made by that time, they didn't take advantage of the university, so that all my social life was off the campus. Meanwhile, while I was in the university, we would once in a while get a speaker. Remember, this was before radio. So we would get speakers. And finally, Dr. Du Bois came to the University of California, because even then, I didn't know anything about Black history.
He stood up. First of all, his presence was something, you know. He commands you just when he stands up. And then he spoke. He didn't look at a note. He didn't read it from a paper. He talked. And the hall, you could hear a pin drop. They listened. And I walked out there feeling, well, it is something to be black.
My first job after college was to work in an office in San Francisco, where I hid my identity. If I'd gone in and said I was black, I wouldn't have gotten the job. But because I had studied Spanish, and it was not versatile, but they didn't know it, I said I was Mexican. Even in civil service, there was discrimination. So finally I told my mother, I'm going to leave California. I don't like to live like this. I can't imagine going on. So in 1925, after I had worked for about 2 years, we left home and came to Chicago, my mother and I. I went to University of Chicago for a few months. I didn't have much money. So I went to Pine Bluff in Arkansas. It was my first time in the South. And I went down scared to death because I'd heard of all these tales. It was an interesting year for one who had known racism, but in a different way. The legislators and the members of the board were all white, and they would come to chapel and they'd get up there and talk about you niggers with no protest on the part of the principal. He was not called president at that time. I decided not to go back, and in the spring, and I'm talking with some of the one or two of the professors, they told me, you know, you ought to go to Hampton. And I made application, and I was accepted. So I left. Then I came to go to Hampton. I came through New York for the first time. I got to New York in 1927 on my way to Hampton. And that is where I met my husband, William Patterson, Pat, who had his office then at 200 West 135th Street and was a partner in one of the prestigious law firms here in town. He had been up to Boston and participated in the struggle for the lives of Sacco and Vanzetti. Every black who went to Hampton Institute became a first in the various departments. The school principal was white. The vast majority of the teachers were white.
All right. So folks can go view that film. I believe it is available on DVD that you can order online and see the whole clip that was filmed in or put together in 2002. So give me 1 second. Sorry, I'm doing all the tech as well in the background. So, all right. So I just want to, before we get started, introduce our great speakers for tonight. I have to say I'm super excited, and I do want to give a shout out to Jamie, who's on the call with me, and all the work at Black Women Radicals, and also Chris Rogers, who's joining in on YouTube from the Paul Robeson House and Museum, which we're working with together on this wonderful series talking about these women. So yeah, Jamie, I don't know if you want to say anything before I introduce our speakers.
No, I just want to say it's like an honor to have like these amazing esteemed guests. Like right before our conversation, we were hit with some news about, I don't know, just like these radical Black women leaders. And we really need to just listen and learn. And I'm super excited to gain this wisdom about Louise Thompson Patterson, because like I was saying, we need to know more about her radical leadership and activism. So thank y'all so much for being here.
Thank you. All right, so I have the honor of introducing both of our esteemed guests tonight. The first is Dr. MaryLouise Patterson, who is a retired pediatrician in clinical practice in New York City. Born in Chicago to two Communist Party USA leaders, Louise and William Patterson, she grew up in Brooklyn, New York. She earned her medical degree from Patrice Lumumba Friendship University in Moscow in the old Soviet Union, and a master's of public health from the University of California, Berkeley. She is the first African-American woman to graduate from medical school in the USSR. And our second guest is Dr. Keith Gilyard, who has passionately embraced African-American expressive culture over the course of his career as a poet, scholar, and educator. Since the 70s, Dr. Gilyard has made significant contributions to English studies as a writer, teacher, and participant in professional associations. His more than 100 publications include the influential education memoir, Voices of the Self, a study of language competence, which published in 1991, the wide-ranging True to the Language Game, African-American Discourse, Cultural Politics and Pedagogy in 2011, and the Revivifying on African-American Rhetoric in 2018 with Adam Banks. He received an American Book Award for his biography, John Oliver Killens, A Life of Black Literary Activism in 2010. His dozens of creative works include the novella, The Next Great Old School Conspiracy from 2016, and poetry volumes Dominant, 7th in 2020, and Monologues in 2020. A native New Yorker, Gilyard is the Edwin, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but Earl Sparks Professor of English and African American Studies at Penn State University. He previously taught at the City University of New York, Medgar Evers College, where he helped to establish the National Black Writers Conference, and at Syracuse University, where he directed the writing program. Active in the Conference on College Composition and Communication, as well as the National Council of Teachers of English since 1983, Gilyard served as chair of the CCCC in 2000 and as president of NCTE in 2012. So with that, I would like to welcome our esteemed guests for tonight, and let me just make sure I pop them up on the screen. A second. All right, I think we're all here now. Just take these spotlights off. All right, so basically this is going to be like an informal conversation. We want to, not make this super robotic, and we want to get as much information out to our viewers and listeners, and just have a conversation. So, welcome again, Dr. Gilyard and Dr. MaryLouise Patterson. So to start our listeners off, could you both give a brief overview of the life of Louise Thompson Patterson from both of your perspectives? Keith, you being her biographer, but also MaryLouise, you growing up as her daughter. So MaryLouise, I don't know if you want to start us off in this conversation. And you're muted.
Never fails. Someone's always muted. Good evening, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the organizations. I want to thank Dante, who's been hosting and talking with us. And I also want to thank the Black Women Radicals and the Paul Robeson House and Museum. Dante, of course, is from the Claudia Jones School for Political Education. And also thank my co-presenter, Professor Keith Gilyard, who wrote the biography of my mother. Thank him for being here tonight. And I would like to toss the ball into his court and say, Keith, won't you start out first?
Okay, well, I can't wait to hear you, though. I'm fascinated by the dynamic with you and your mother. So to me, I came to write about Louise almost by accident. It was out of embarrassment. Because when I wrote the biography of John Oliver Killens, I included a photo, and it was a photo of Louise Thompson Patterson with Paul Robeson, Alpheus Hunton, and Dorothy Hunton. I think it was taken when Alpheus Hunton was released from prison in Virginia. And I identified the other people in the photo. I didn't know who Louise was. I knew it was Paul Robeson. I knew it was Alpheus. I knew it was Dorothy. I didn't know who she was. And then when I was going through papers for the Killens book, I realized that when she left New York, when she moved for the final time and she went west, Killens actually came to her going away party, and he gave a testimonial at her party and said all these things about this woman. I said, wait a minute, who is this person? I didn't know. And so that piqued my curiosity. So then I started reading a lot of different literature, and everywhere you turn, you saw that she was being mentioned. Like she was here, she was there, she was involved with that, she was part of that. So that was really the beginning of it. And then when I looked at a lot of information, a lot of the information I was checking was wrong. You know, there were a lot of facts about her, in quote, facts, but the facts were not actually accurate. So that's when I really got into it. I didn't really want to do a biography because doing a biography is not easy. And I think MaryLouise might remember this differently, but then I got a call. I was talking with Larry Jackson about it, and he visited MaryLouise, and I think they kind of talked it up. And I got a call from Mary. It's the first time I talked with her. I got a call from her, and she said, "I heard you were interested in doing a book about my mother." I said, "Wow, I hadn't really committed to that at that point, but I decided to go ahead and do it because there was no good reason other than laziness not to do it." So to me, and the more I've researched her, just a fascinating person, born leader, I would say. I mean, she had so much that she could have done. If you played that clip more, she would have talked about her encounter with Du Bois, and Du Bois cautioned her because Du Bois knew, you know, you're a graduate of Berkeley. Louise graduated from Berkeley in 1923. Imagine that. She was the president of the Delta chapter. We're going to talk about radical. She was the president of the Deltas at Berkeley, you know, so she had a lot of ways she could have gone in sort of mainstream society, but she felt that she had to choose the left. It was a matter of a conscience for her. It's a matter of belief, and she was committed all the way to the end. So that's the way I begin it.
I'll dovetail with that and say, first of all, I want to kind of correct the history here. And Professor Gilyard and I, Keith and I, go back and forth about this all the time, and it's but I had read the John Oliver Killens biography, and I was very impressed. And I'd been looking for someone to do Louise's biography, so you just seemed a natural. So yeah, Larry and I may have, you know, talked about it, but you were already on my radar.
Oh, okay.
So thank you for doing a wonderful biography of Louise.
Thank you, appreciate it.
You know, I don't know how one talks about one's mother. You know, there are just so many ways in which to do that. You know, you're born to someone who's older, not your generation, or usually not your generation. And so you don't know them before they birthed you, right? You don't know their life before they birthed you. And it so happens that my mother had me late in her life. I was right before she couldn't have children anymore. I was born, my mother was 41 years old. And so she had lived, you know, 41 very, very active years that I really only learned about, regretfully, after my mother died. So the many questions that I would have and should have asked her when she was alive, I never really did. Louise was a wonderful mother. Of course, when I was born, she was in Chicago. I was born in Chicago, and she was there organizing at the time for the IWO and the International Workers' Order. And so there was work to be done. This was during the war, World War II. And Louise really didn't have time for a baby. So, you know, not that I was really in the way, but she didn't have time to spend, you know, 25 out of 24 hours taking care of me. So, you know, she hired someone to take care of me. And that was my beginning. The other thing was that Louise really only wanted to talk to children when they could talk back, you know, to be involved with children when they could, when you could really interact with them, and they were conscious, you know, and they were consciously interacting back with you. So, you know, I was born at a time when both my parents, my father was there doing the, trying to start the Communist Party newspaper in the Midwest. There was a newspaper in New York and a newspaper in California, but there was no newspaper in the Midwest, and Chicago certainly was the heart of the Midwest. And so he was there. It was called the Midwest Daily, and I think the Midwest Daily, right, Keith? And he was also working to start a workers' school called the Abraham Lincoln School. It was to be a school for workers to attend to learn about organizing, to learn about labor history, about progressive radical history, to learn about African-American history. And so that's where I got my start. My parents came back to New York when I was 5 years old. And one of the interesting things about my family was that my mother was the one who financially maintained the family. My father, being kind of a professional radical, never made any kind of money to speak of, although, as you mentioned about Louise, Pat could have also chosen a much greater, a path that was paved with gold, but instead also chose to dedicate his life to making radical progressive change. So there was very little money to be had. So the Louise was the one who sustained the family financially. All of the years of my life living with them and then beyond. She was a woman of many skills. She was an organizer par excellence, but she also had secretarial skills, which she used to help Herbert Aptheker start the American Marxist Study Institute, AIMS, in the late 1960s, 70s here in New York City. She was the secretary for the Council on African Affairs. Also, as you know, she co-organized the Sojourners for Truth and Justice in the 1950s. And then she rose in the ranks of the International Workers' Order, from starting out as a clerk to becoming a vice president at the end of her time with the IWO. So Louise was incredible in that way. She was a fantastic cook. She loved to bring people together. She loved parties and introducing people and widening our circles, our private social circles that then could broaden into social political circles. So she did that all the time. And then our house was always open for people who needed a place to stay. So the actress Bea Richards came to live with us when she left Los Angeles to come to New York to make her way in the theater. There was a singer by the name of Ruth Reese, who later had to leave the country. She was an alto, I think, alto contralto singer like Marian Anderson, but could not make her way here in the States and left for Europe, but she lived with us for a while. And then there were various and sundry people throughout the years who would come and stay at our home. So we always had an open door. So she was a very social person and one who just, who loved life. And because of her love for life and her love for people, Louise fought for the liberty and the freedom and the dignity of people, especially her people, African-American people, her entire life. She dedicated her life to that. So maybe I'll stop there and take a question from Jamie or from Dante or from Chris.
Yes, thank you for opening that up. It really provides context about Louise Thompson Patterson's life and legacy. But for Dr. Gilyard, I'm interested, you touched on a little bit about why you started writing the book, but I'm interested in knowing what were some interesting tidbits about Louise Thompson Patterson's life that you came across, and also did you leave anything out of the book as well?
There were couple of surprises. One of the things that I hadn't like the Delta piece surprised me because I wasn't looking for that. And she actually gave a commencement address back at Berkeley when she was in her 90s, and she mentioned that that she had been at Delta at Berkeley, and they were all the chirping went off in the audience and whatnot. It was funny. But also, when she was arrested in Alabama during organizing back in the 30s, the Delta chapter actually reached out to her when they took her to jail. They actually wrote her and said, "We got your back. We don't care about the politics of everything. Delta first." And so that was interesting to me to understand that connection. I think she placed a value on that connection. I think the other thing that interested me was that she was a bit of a sports fan, which I was surprised by. She was an avid when she taught at Hampton. She was an avid tennis player. I mean, she was a great teacher. She put a lot into teaching at Hampton, but when the teaching was over, she had the tennis racket and she was headed for the tennis court. And so she was like Naomi and Serena, way back in the day. So I didn't even realize that. And then even later in life, I was reading a transcript of a conversation when Bo Jackson got hurt playing football, when he hurt his hip, and he had to retire from football. And she was talking about that. She was like, "Well, will the young man be all right?" Like she was concerned about Bo. So those are things that humanize it to me beyond the organizing and the political stuff. Those were other things that were interesting to me. So in terms of leaving stuff out of the book, not so much of things I couldn't find. And like Louise visited China, but I could not, she kept a journal when she visited Russia, but she did not, at least I haven't been able to find it. She did not keep the same records when she visited China. So I was very curious about what her impressions would have been or what they were, on that trip. William Patterson kept the journal when he was in China. And so I was able to figure out a couple of dates from his journal, which is in the archives at Howard University. But as far as I know, Louise didn't keep a China journal, so that wasn't there. And then the other thing I was curious about is that I looked at some FBI records, and it was a little bit of a dust up, I would say, between Louise and the author of a book that came out in 1952. And the records are redacted. So I couldn't actually say that she was discussing or debating this thing with Ellison, but she was saying you need to retract that book and whatnot. So I wasn't able to close the circle, but I'm assuming that she and Ralph Ellison were directly at odds over Invisible Man.
I would imagine she was as well, Keith. And in terms of the trip to China, it was quite revelatory. We had, that was in 1960, and my father had just recently gotten his passport back about 6 months earlier, and he left to go to Europe and to the Soviet Union, was my understanding. But in fact, my father had been sent to China by the Communist Party. Well, since China was off limits to Americans at that time, when we left to join my father, my understanding was that we were going to the Soviet Union. But ultimately, we did fly to Moscow, from Prague to Moscow, but in Moscow, we were only there a day, and we were on a plane to China. And that's where we joined up with my father. I think perhaps she didn't keep a journal because it was off limits. I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. But that was my first reaction when you said that, that she didn't keep it probably for that reason. China was at that time just a tableau in contrasts. You would see a cart drawn by a man that was loaded with barrels or boxes or crates of stuff alongside a Russian lorry on the same street. Those kinds of contrasts right in the middle of Beijing. But it was, China was wonderful. At least I found it so. And I wanted to stay and go to school there, and I was offered the opportunity. And my mother said, well, by that time, my father had left. He had to return. And so my mother said, well, she was going to stay on at least for a couple of months to make sure that I was settled in okay, and to figure out how they were going to be able to correspond with me, since China was off limits. You couldn't write letters or make telephone calls or send telegrams. So to work out all of those kinds of details. And so while we were there settling in for me to go to school, the Sino-Soviet split occurred. And my father was still in Moscow at the time. So there we were settling in for me to stay in China. And then all of a sudden, one morning, our interpreter comes in along with one of the representatives from the party who were hosting us, and said, you'll be getting on a plane and going back to Moscow. And my mother may have known why, but I had no idea what was going on. And so we got on a plane and left. And but we went to Shanghai, we went to Harbin, we went to Dalian, we went to a number of other cities that I don't recall right now. And we're really impressed with what seemed to be cooperative, not only cooperative living, but cooperative being. The leadership of the party at the time all lived in the same neighborhoods as other working people. They didn't live in special chalets, or they didn't seem to have special accommodations. They rode their bicycles every day to the Communist Party office just the way everybody else was riding their bicycles to work. And it seemed like they were constructing a new world, a new man, a new society, a new way of living, a new way of thinking and of being. So I was very smitten with China and what I saw. And so when I wound up staying in the Soviet Union to go to medical school there, I had a little red book. I ultimately had a little red book. Oh, okay. So that was the China piece. And then the other person that she had issues with in terms of writers was Duberman, and Duberman's biography of Paul Robeson. It wasn't just Ellison, but it was Duberman as well. And she went on to organize a Black writer's response to Duberman's biography. And also his Duberman's biography, and also who was the white writer who wrote the article on Nat Turner?
Styron.
Yes, Styron. And she organized a response to Styron as well.
Wow, thank y'all so much. I'll popcorn it to Dante, but I just want to say I could listen to you both all day. I'm learning so much. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And I'm loving the filling in the gaps that you two sort of reinforce each other. It's beautiful. So this next question is for Dr. MaryLouise. You've already touched on a lot of it, but I did want to uplift one thing you already said earlier, which was the Abraham Lincoln School that was, I believe, in Chicago, right? So, and the Jefferson School that existed in the 40s, right, in Harlem. So I would just say the Claudia Jones School is trying to continue that lineage of those workers and popular education projects that were developed, synthesized, formed, whatever you want to call it, by the party and other progressives until McCarthy period, right? So I just wanted to uplift that so much because that's where we're coming from in many ways, and trying to build something like that in DC. So that it's so important. But yeah, so my question is, and actually I wanted to slightly dive into this, not slightly dive in, but touch on this China topic since we're kind of on that. But the question I was going to ask, could you tell us a little bit about your upbringing, being a red diaper baby by these of these two outstanding Black revolutionaries, which you've already touched on. You've already touched on this part too, which is growing up in the Soviet Union and subsequently China during a tumultuous time where your father was being hounded by, the U.S. government, basically McCarthyites, because in 1951 he wrote this petition to the UN, right, and they were trying to take his passport away, et cetera, arrest him overseas.
Well, actually, he was put in prison.
Yep, there he was. Yes, that's right. So y'all can fill in any gaps I'm missing. But and there's actually a great biography where your dad has his own autobiography that he wrote, but Gerald Horne's biography of William Patterson is such a beautiful read, and you learn so much history. And I was trying to get Gerald on this talk, but he declined. So, but we'll get him in the future. Hopefully, we'll talk about your dad. Hopefully. And so anyways, I don't want to get too caught up in tangents, but, just talk about, your upbringing, as a red diaper baby, which you've already touched on a bit. And then
I would like her to
talk. Go ahead.
I read a letter her father wrote to her and explained to her some things that were going on. She must have been, MaryLouise must have been about 9 years old maybe. And he wrote her and explained, they said like, he tried to explain this is in a way that she could understand it for her age. So I wonder if she could talk about that. I'd like to hear that.
Was that the letter where he was trying to explain why he was in jail?
Yes.
Well, first of all, to try to fill in a little bit, and Dante, if I get too far off the point, please pull me back. Being raised by two, not only were they members of the Communist Party, not only were they Black radicals in the wonderful tradition of Black radicalism, but they were also intellectuals. So both of them had gone to university, at a time when the overwhelming majority of African Americans did not have that opportunity. So I was being raised by Black radical intellectuals who didn't have any money, but they brought that intellectual, that intellectual curiosity about life and analytics, into our life. So I grew up around a lot of books. I was an only child of my mother's, and my mother worked, as I mentioned. She was the one who, for the most part, was the one who was putting food on the table. And I'm sure that was something that they discussed, because my parents, to me, it seemed that they discussed just about everything that happened in their lives. So they must have discussed the fact that Louise would be the primary breadwinner for the family. My father was a feminist in the best of that, the best use of that term. In the best sense of that term. And so he would, for instance, when I was a teenager, he would call home every day and say, "Now, Mary Lou," that's what they called me. "Now, Mary Lou, is dinner on? Your mother's been working all day and she'll be tired when she gets home." So things like that. My father washed dishes. My father every morning would get up before my mother, make breakfast, and take her breakfast on a tray every morning. And on Sunday, it was with the New York Times, so that she could stay in bed and do the Times crossword puzzle, which was another wonderful thing that Louise loved to do. So yes, she was into sports. You're right. She played tennis very early in her life. Keith, she started playing tennis when she was a teenager, when she arrived in Berkeley, really. She learned how to play tennis and was an avid tennis player. And then she was a Giant fan. a New York baseball Giant fan, and my father and I were Dodger fans. So I was a latchkey child, as we were called, children who came home to an empty apartment, until my mother was able to arrange for me to stay with another family that lived in the same building that we lived in, an apartment building in Harlem. And then I would come home and stay with them until my parents came home. And that may have been after an incident that I recall where the FBI actually came to the home and I was home by myself. And I opened the door, they rang the doorbell, and I opened the door. And these were two white men. And they asked, as I recall, for my parents. But I knew not to let them in. And so I closed the door on them, slammed the door on them. And at that time, telephones did not have dedicated lines. You had what was called a party line, so that several people shared the same telephone line. Now I know the younger people listening tonight don't have no idea what that was, but it means that several families in your building, if you lived in an apartment building or maybe on a block, I don't know about it in private homes, but in our apartment building at least, you shared a telephone line. And so you could pick up the phone and someone else could be using it. Someone else in another apartment was on the telephone line, so you couldn't use it until they hung up. So anyway, I got on the phone. As I recall, there was a woman talking on the phone, and I told her she had to hang up because I had to call my mother and tell her what had just happened. You know, as Dante, as best as possible, my parents really tried to create a sense of security for me, while at the same time not shielding me from what they were doing. So they didn't want me to be fearful, but they always wanted me to know why they were doing what they were doing and why the police or the FBI or these white men, these strange white men, would be coming after them. So I did not grow up, as I recall, with particular fear. Even though I visited my father in jail at Danbury Prison, every weekend we would go and visit him while he was incarcerated. I didn't grow up fearful, and I didn't grow up hounded as many other children, particularly children of white communists. Those children, many of those children were denounced by the FBI in their schools, were openly followed to and from school, were approached to rat out their parents. None of that happened to me, and I don't think it really happened to any of the other children of Black communists, at least not in New York City. I think there was some measure of protection living in the Black community from the harassment and hounding by the FBI during that McCarthy Red Scare period, the McCarthy period in the 1950s. You know, and that was a horrible period. For those of you who are listening who may not know, there was a couple by the name of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg who were actually executed by the government of the United States for being members of the Communist Party, and two, for allegedly spying for the Soviet Union. So it was a dangerous time, and people were losing jobs, people were losing their marriages, losing their homes, losing their families. And so it was a dangerous time, but they did the best they could to have me not feel fearful. And that, I think that holds true for Esther and Jim Jackson and their two daughters, Harriet and Kathy Jackson, for Louis and Dorothy Burnham, whose children were Claudia and Margaret and Linda and Charles Burnham, and for Ed Strong and Augusta Strong, who had three daughters, they really tried to create a community for us where we felt safe. As I said, my mother was the one who was the breadwinner, so she got up and went to work every day, but my father did too. He got up every morning, he made breakfast. He was also so disciplined, he jumped rope every day to keep in shape. He never drank, he never smoked. My mother drank and smoked. And then on Friday nights, we would watch the Friday night fights. This was on television, so we would watch on television, Friday night, the fights. We would watch Dragnet, which was one of the first cop shows on television. It was a very popular show. And there were a couple of other shows that we would watch as a family. We always watched as a family. There was only one television, and it was in the common area of the apartment. So it was in our dining room. And I would sit between them sometimes, and then I'd sit between my mother and Bia, and we would watch television. And then we would play Scrabble or we would play cards. So they taught me how to play cards, how to play bridge, how to play pinochle. In other words, it was a family. I mean, they created a family life that was crucial to my growing up, but also crucial to them. It sustained them when the fight outside the home was so vicious and so hard. They had to have a sanctuary. And our home and our family and the family life that they created was such for them and for their comrades. So I hope I have answered at least some of your questions, Dante. I know I wandered here and there.
You're totally fine. That was beautiful. And I don't know if Keith, did you want to add anything before we move to the next?
No, that's good. I just the only thing is that as I watch Mary Lou talk, I'm reminded of how much she favors her mother in the face. she looks a lot like her, especially the lower half of the face. It's like I'm looking at her.
Wow. Yeah. I think for particularly the young people listening, the importance of how you live as a revolutionary, as an activist, whether it's active in a political struggle, active in a labor union, active on your job, how you live your personal life and how that give and take between your personal life and this public life that you lead, the importance of that. And my parents were communists with big C's outside the apartment, but they were definitely communists with little c's inside the apartment. The sharing, the caring, the mutual respect and regard. So I was trying to build this picture of Louise and Pat as human beings, who they were in their totality, not just as political activists, but how they behaved in their private space, and they lived their values. They lived their politics. So much so that I thought that was the way, and so did the Burnhams and the Jacksons. I thought that's the way every family behaved. I really did. I didn't know any different. So it was kind of a rude awakening in some ways for me. I was sheltered in that regard, but amazing upbringing in terms of the literature that I was exposed to, and of course the struggles that I was exposed to. And the other thing that I would say is because they lived in the Northeast and they were members of the left, I grew up around white people from the time that I can remember. So I did not grow up in a segregated community or in a multiracial community, but a segregated life within that community. So it was a very different kind of upbringing for me, very different perhaps than the traditional upbringing of other Black children whose parents may have been middle class, middle income, children of intellectuals. but who were not a part of the left.
Yeah, this is so beautiful to be listening to this. So honored to be in this space right now. So just thank you so much for everything right now. So I did want to pivot slightly because I did get a request from Dr. Gilyard to play the W.B. Du Bois biography in 4 voices and play a short clip of Louise's little part in the film. So let me pull it up quickly and then we can move on with the rest of the conversation. Oops, sorry.
As Dr. Du Bois's 83rd birthday was coming, I was asked to help organize a dinner for it. We had a very fine setup of people who sponsored it, and the Essex House was a very excellent place to have it, right across from Central Park. 2 weeks before the event was to take place, Dr. Du Bois was indicted.
Du Bois was rejected by all but a few of his talented tenth, an old notion which now evaporates in the heat of the Red Scare.
Well, everything fell apart, except Franklin Frazier stayed on as chairman. Not only did Essex House cancel the contract, but we could not find one hotel south of 110th Street that would accept it. I went to Harlem, and I went into Small's Paradise to talk to Ed Small to see whether we could get that place for it. He was very cynical. He said, well, you folks always go downtown and give your money to the white folks until you get in trouble, and then you come to us. But he was very nice and gave us the whole place, upstairs and down.
Even as they prepared for the trial, they were making plans for another event. Du Bois and his longtime friend Shirley Graham announced they were getting married.
It was decided that they would get married.
All right, yeah, I just want to play that short clip on behalf of Professor Gilyard, and feel free to add any comments, but I do want to pass the floor to Jimmy, but yeah, feel free to add any comments.
Yeah, one thing about that clip, I think it's that clip during that interview where she talks about her time during, which we haven't talked about, but she talked about her time during the Harlem Renaissance period, and how the hangout patterns were back then. She said her crew, they got down in the groove. Other people were more stiff, but Louise was more of a party person. Back during the Renaissance. I mean, she's with a free spirit like Langston. We haven't mentioned Langston, but she and Langston were free spirits and kindred spirits, I think, in a way. And MaryLouise could talk more about that, but they were very close. They were very close. I used to think that Louise was a little bit of the big sister because for a long time we thought Langston Hughes was born in 1902. Now that we know he was born in 1901, we realize that he is actually a few months older than Louise, but still, to me, that doesn't change the dynamic. I always, in reading all their work and their correspondence, I have the sense that Louise was the big sister to Langston. I just have that feeling in their correspondence, in reading their correspondence.
Yeah, I agree with you, Keith. I think that's the way the relationship was kind of structured, and that was the dynamic in the relationship. But yeah, they were definitely brother and sister kind of relationship, very completely trustful and open, and so much so that people who were curious about Langston's sexuality would always, want to interview Louise and would pepper her with questions about Langston's sexuality, which Louise would never answer. That was not information that was hers to give out. And I think Langston knew that. Yeah, they were buddies. They were siblings. And you're right. They got into mischief.
Right. Definitely.
Of one kind or another.
Because I think Louise is the only one from that period that actually met Langston's mother and father. I think no one else has that claim from that generation.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Maybe the Bontops aren't a Bontops.
Maybe, yeah.
Family,
I suppose.
Could. Yeah. But Langston was, not that we want to get off into Langston necessarily, because we could just do a whole thing on that, right? But it was a close relationship from the time that they met at Hampton until Langston died in 1967. Yeah, and there is a correspondence. I'm going to shamelessly plug my book. There's a correspondence that
Great book.
Almost 40 years worth of writing back and forth between my parents and my co-author's parents, who were best friends, the Crawfords, Matt and Evelyn Crawford, and their daughter, Evelyn Louise Crawford, and I co-authored a book of the correspondence between the five of them, my parents, her parents, and Langston Hughes. And the book is entitled Letters from Langston, From the Harlem Renaissance to the Red Scare and Beyond. And it's available, Amazon. Don't use Amazon, get your local bookstore to order it and get it from the bookstore, or make the library get it and get it from the library. But Amazon does have it. So does Barnes and Nobles and, I guess some of the other online bookstores. So wait a minute, I lost track of where were we?
Talk about Langston a little bit, but you were going to segue from that to something else. I will mention about Langston, since if we're still on Langston, that Langston actually wrote one, I think it's two. He actually wrote two poems on the occasion of MaryLouise's birth. So I was always jealous about that, as I don't have any famous poet writing about me when I'm born, like Welcome to the World. And he's telling her what she has to do when she grows up, so it's an amazing family connection, really, the Pattersons and Langston Hughes.
Their lives, my mother, especially, I think my mother was the one who brought my father into that more literary and cultural part of the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't only cultural. We should correct the record. Mm-hmm. It was also political. Excuse me. So my father was more on the political side with Cyril Phillips and Claude McKay and others like that. Whereas my mother was more on the cultural side until she came back from the Soviet Union, a trip in 1932 that she organized of 22 African Americans to go to the Soviet Union, to go to Moscow to make a movie called Black and White. The movie was never made, but they toured so the movie was never made, period. While they were there, they toured the Soviet Union. And when they went to the southern portion of the Soviet Union at that time, to Uzbekistan, they were really moved. And Langston writes a lot about that, about how moved they were by what they saw. These were people who had no written alphabet, who then, as a result of the revolution, had an alphabet. They had no institutions of higher learning. Women were not allowed to learn, not allowed to go to school. And so they saw the changes that the socialist revolution had made in the lives of those people. And they came back and immersed themselves in the Scottsboro case. And that was, I think, the seminal point. That was the pivotal point for Louise, I think, in her decision to really get involved with the Communist Party, with leftist politics, with radical politics, with labor and organizing. Pat, my father, was already involved. And Langston also becomes radicalized when he sees the possibilities that are presented when workers actually have a chance to shape the destiny of their lives, and to enjoy the fruits of their labor.
Yeah, she kept an amazing journal of their trip. So not only was Langston writing, but she was writing. She kept a very extensive journal of their trip. Also, a series of letters that she wrote to her mother, which would be your grandmother. She wrote a number of letters to her explaining why she was doing what she was doing, and her mother was kind of cheering her on, do what you have to do. And now that was, and she does say that. She says she went, she had curiosities, but when she came back off of that trip, she was committed. She was a committed revolutionary when she got back home.
So, like many people who've gone on Venceremos brigades to Cuba and come back, radicalized. And Dante, in your intro, I just wanted to add Haiti to that list of countries, the peoples of which we are supportive of, that are Haitian brothers and sisters who have never stopped suffering that's been imposed on them from the moment of the triumph of their, magnificent revolution. They've paid the price for that every single day since then. So here's to the valiant Haitian people, the beautiful Haitian people.
Thank y'all both, and for just a rich discussion. I'm like, we should see everyone on Twitter just, tweeting about the conversation, and just, I could listen to you both speak all day. But I really want to talk about Claudia Jones and the connection between Claudia Jones and Louise Thompson Patterson, right? So Claudia Jones is typically credited with terming and laying the foundation for what she called triple oppression, which also may be called intersectionality today by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. But Louise Patterson actually termed triple exploitation in the 1930s prior to Claudia Jones's 1949 piece, An End to Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman. Can one of you comment on the piece that Patterson wrote and how it contributed to Claudia's thinking around 1949?
To a Brighter Dawn. I mean, I'm sure Claudia read it, and plus they knew each other, so I'm sure they talked. I mean, they were conversant. As a matter of fact, when Louise was in England, she and Claudia went to visit Robeson when Robeson was living in England. They spent 8 hours at his house. They kind of wore him out, So they actually knew each other and talked about all kinds of things. But the term, as far as I remember, I think I'm remembering this right. Louise was actually in a workshop about women at the National Negro Congress in 1935. And so she wouldn't claim to have coined the term triple exploitation. The way she explains it, I believe, is that in that workshop, they started talking about triple exploitation, how women were triply exploited. So that's it's almost like hip hop. If you Herc or you got to be a certain person that you can tell the origin story. So she was in the room, but she doesn't claim to have coined the term. She says it came out of the workshop. And so she wrote an article after that. And so the first article that she wrote after that, she used that term, triple exploitation. I think that was 1935. So that's 14 years or so before Claudia used it.
It was 1936.
36, okay.
And, and she, in that article, is talking about the, she talks about the exploitation of Black sharecropper women. And then she goes on to talk about Black women who were laboring in what was called the Bronx labor market. And these were women who were doing domestic work, but were doing it on a daily basis. And they would have to go and they would sit on benches on a certain avenue in the Bronx and wait for the white women to come and pick them to work in their homes for the day. So that was what the article was about. Marvel Cook, who was also a member of the Communist Party and an African-American woman member of the Communist Party of Harlem, articles about that and the Bronx labor market. It was infamous. So yeah, it's, I have to say that up until the point that Eric McDuffie wrote his book in 2011, I think it was, right? Focusing on 4 African-American women who were I guess the first generation, generation 1 of Black radical feminists. That Eric was the first one who I think really brought to light again the work of Black radical feminists, and how what they did and the groundwork that they laid really informed the later, the later work of around sit-ins, around Angela Davis's campaign, around, for that matter, Black Lives Matter. So, it's important that these stories.
I would say too that Du Bois labeled her also. Remember, Du Bois labeled her in the 30s when she was in Birmingham, and he, in the crisis, he said she was the leading woman in the communist movement. I don't think that she was necessarily looking for that endorsement, but Du Bois has laid it on her, so he identified her that way in the 30s.
Well, he was kind of a mentor to Louise, as she I think thought of him as such. Yes. Ever since she talked about that lecture he gave at Berkeley, where he got up and spoke for an hour with not one note, at least not one note visible to anybody in the audience, right?
I actually went in that room. I tried to feel the vibe. It's 10 Wheeler Hall. So when I was on that campus, I found the Wheeler building and went in there and tried to feel some vibes in there. I didn't feel anything though. But that I can imagine. I can picture that scenario.
So Jamie, to your point, I think it's important that that Black women today who are on the front line of the struggle, whether it's Black Lives Matter or other organizations, we've got Stacey Abrams. I mean, Black women are really now in the forefront of many of our struggles that we all know, who laid the earlier cement, pavement, who blazed the trail earlier on around these very same struggles, the struggle for dignity and freedom and jobs and housing and healthcare, decent pay, who led those struggles earlier on. And to know, it's important for especially Black children to know that since we were brought here to this continent, we have fought for our freedom. We have fought to democratize this country, and that they are born into a tradition of struggle that is heroic. That's beautiful.
Yeah, Louise was just such an intellectual, just so wise. One of my favorite interviews, you talk about current politics, occurred in the late 80s. I forget who she's talking with, but they asked her about the collapse of the Soviet Union, and isn't this proof that you folks have been thinking in folly? And she went back off it. She was like, wait a minute. She said, wait a minute, how long did that experiment last? 70 years? She said, how long has Christianity been around? 2,000 years. She said, we just really getting started. I'm older than the Soviet movement. So, is she really, but she had to think about it. She said, I have to think about this, I have to analyze this, and they were asking about, current issues. And, she said, well, the man thinks he's still over the woman, so a fundamental contradiction for her always was sexism as well. So those are things I remember from the later Louise interviews.
And one of the things she would also say later to answer that question about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, as it was called, was she'd say, well, how many times did it take Marie Curie to get that experiment right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember I can hear her in my head saying that,
Right.
It wasn't the one-time experiment that she got it right.
Right.
She did it over 1,000 times before she got it right and won the Nobel Prize.
Right.
And then her husband, remember, her husband had to go and accept the prize. They wouldn't let a woman, talking about sexism,
Right.
woman, she couldn't accept her own Nobel Prize. Her husband had to go and get it. So,
and then what I like too is she went to see Do the Right Thing with you.
yes.
Spike Lee movie.
Yeah. I was a part. I mean, I was a part of their lives. I went to meetings. I got dragged to meetings. You know, I mean, I didn't particularly want to go to a meeting. I got dragged to meetings. I got dragged to demonstrations, and you know, I learned how to put out a leaflet. And you all young people don't even know what I'm talking about. But we had what's called a pictograph machine. First of all, you had to type on a typewriter where it was each separate key. And you put in this paper that was inked on one side. Now, if you weren't careful, you get the ink all over your fingers. And so you would type whatever it was. I mean, you couldn't make the kind of corrections on the computer that you could delete a word or delete a misspelling and
right.
You know. So that was number one. And then you had this mimeo. So you're laughing because you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah.
So then you had these long sheets that you would then type on, and then you had to ink them or ink the table, right? And you would insert the sheet and you would turn the sheet over. This is like printing, really. And out would come a copy. I learned how to do all that.
The kids now would say that's extra. They said that's extra.
That's right. Wait a minute. Was that the cream on the top, or was that the extra, like washing the dishes when the meal is over? Whichever the extra it was. Yeah. I learned how to do it. Now, of course, it's dead and gone.
It's all gone.
Knows what it is.
This is great. So we're running a little bit close to the hour, and I don't know if y'all have to go right at 8 or the hour, if y'all want to stay on a little bit more to help answer questions from the audience.
Oh, yeah, I'd be happy to.
Okay. Yeah. I'm letting y'all just talk, man. So I just want to make sure you don't have like a commitment.
Yeah, I'll be right back. I just have to get a drink of water. I'll be right back. It's hot in here.
Yeah, so I did want to pivot to the while Dr. Gilyard's getting a drink of water, to the Q&A real quick, and then I have a last question from our pre-prepared questions that I want to kind of finish on, which I think is a good one. So I'm going to combine these two, and then I'll ask Keith again when he returns. But MaryLouise, you can chime in your thoughts. So this is a question from, I think it's Herschel Hartman in the Q&A. And they're both about the IWO, the International Workers Order that Louise led. So one is, I'm hoping to hear more about Louise's work in the IWO, which a broad question. And then there was a comment here. It was the IWO that commissioned Langston's great anthem, "Let American Be American Again." Did Louise play a role in that?
And also published a volume of his poetry. The first volume he wrote after he got back from Spain. They published a new song. Was that a new song? I think that's it.
It was a new song.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Louise pretty much built that IWO. I mean, when you look, I've been all through the IWO archives at Cornell. I went to Cornell and went through all those records, and she's all in the minutes. She's got the gavel. She's running meetings. She pretty much, when you look at the growth in the membership of when Louise became like the Midwest, particularly the Midwest was her region. She built it. I would say she built that organization to the extent that they got the numbers that they got. She was largely responsible for that. I think a lot of the stuff we think about New York, but a lot of her stuff in Chicago, those Chicago years are definitely worth studying. When she was working with Ishmael Flory, Claude Lightfoot, Oscar Brown Jr., activists, progressives like that in Chicago. That period, I think that 10-year period, which of course MaryLouise wouldn't remember because she wasn't born, but that period is definitely worth studying, the Chicago years and the growth of the IWO for sure.
Yeah, Louise was responsible for the Suitcase Theater's first production. It was in an IWO at one of the IWO's facilities in New York City. He suggested the name that she first of all got the IWO to print a new song, and then suggested that name for the title of the little booklet that was printed. Louise was very proud of the IWO and the work that she did in the IWO and the work that the IWO was doing in terms of building fraternal solidarity amongst workers.
Yeah, and plus where she had to go, I mean, she had to go into those communities, man, backwater, I mean, back in some deep rural areas, and all the different European ethnic groups, and she was on the road a lot to build that organization. That was tremendous work. Yeah. And she the Harlem Suitcase Theater, she founded that when Langston Hughes was in Spain. He wrote to her and said, I need a theater. He said, Lou, he called her Lou, I need a theater, so he knows that Louise is an organizer. If you need it to happen, she can put it together. She's organizer supreme. She spent a lifetime doing it, knows how to do it. So with Langston's inspiration and her organizational skills, they put the Harlem Suitcase Theater together, and they had a production starring Robert Earl Jones, James Earl Jones's father. He was a star. He was a star in that production. So yeah, I mean, you could go on and on. I mean, she showed up everywhere. She just showed up everywhere. That's just the thing.
Thank y'all for answering that question. So there's another question from Phil. And their question is, I wonder if Dr. Gilyard and or Dr. Patterson could discuss more about Louise Thompson Patterson's work with Sojourners for Truth and Justice and the network of Black men radicals who participated in the Sojourners for Truth and Justice.
Yeah, that's a whole long story. But the short story is that it was she and Bea Richards really were the movers and shakers on that. They stayed up. I think they did a writing session where they might have stayed up like 24, 30 hours straight to put the call together, and then from there organized a trip to Washington and got a number of people involved. Of course, Lorraine Hansberry was involved. Claudia Jones couldn't make the trip to DC. She was shut down. She couldn't make it, but almost, who's who really of Black women activists went to DC with the Sojourners. Of course, the Sojourners were compromised by McCarthyism. They were shut down. Fear campaigns shut down a lot of people who would have been involved. Some people lost their jobs and stuff like that. So given the era, you just couldn't sustain that. And plus, Louise was on trial also during the 50s. She had to go to court on her own case involving some of the IWO stuff. I don't, for some reason, the details of that, her appearance in court are a little fuzzy to me right now. But yeah, all that was early 50s stuff, early 50s stuff. But then also you got to remember too, in the 60s, that she became active in the Angela Davis defense campaign and actually went to Europe to advocate over there on behalf of Angela in England and in France, and was actually over there on International Women's Day on March 8, I think in March 71. And she landed back in New York the day of the Ali Frazier fight. So she was interested in that as well. So just the Sojourners is a long story. Like I said, I have archives. I have an old archives of the Sojourners. So if anyone will get in touch with me, I can go through Sojourner stuff. I have the records. The initial call, all the meetings, the minutes, the trip to Washington. I have all of that.
Well, I'm coming back really quickly to do our little plug before I popcorn to Dante, but we do want to do an event on the Sojourners for Truth and Justice. So just putting that plug out there.
Got you.
So the Sojourners were seen kind of as an outgrowth of the CRC, the Civil Rights Congress. And this happened at a time, they were in response to the indictment of W.E.B. Du Bois and the taking of his passport, of the taking of Paul Robeson's passport, my father's passport, Alpheus Hunton, who was another African-American intellectual, great intellectual, who worked with Du Bois on the African Encyclopedia in Ghana. And their passports were lifted, and Black men who were leftists were being hounded, you know, and they rose up in response. And you're right, Keith, they stayed up all night writing that call, calling women to come together to defend African-American men and to defend the African-American community. And they went to DC. And women came from all over. Charlotta Bass from California, from Los Angeles. She had the newspaper, the California Eagle. You had Aslanda Robeson, Paul Robeson's wife. Mary McLeod Bethune signed the petition. I'm just trying to think of it. It was a broad coalition of women, but women activists calling, you know, challenging the government on their harassment, continued harassment of African Americans. It was, you know, had that organization managed to live, what, you know, there's almost nothing they couldn't have done. And they had a song, remember? I'm trying to.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
We are sojourners. I can't. You know, at Jamie, at your conference, I'll be able to do it, but I can't do it tonight. But they had a song, a Sojourner song. They were incredible women. Yeah.
All right. So we're getting close to the hour, so hopefully we can. Two more questions, one from YouTube and then one last one to wrap it up. So this one's from Shelby Green on YouTube. They had sort of two questions, and this actually helps with sort of our closer as well. So one is, it would be nice to hear how Miss Louise navigated the challenges and threats during like the McCarthy period. And then a follow-up question, more broad question, if y'all have any advice for young Black women radicals organizing for justice, especially in quote unquote progressive spaces that support Black votes, but not Black liberation.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, Mary Louise probably has a better perspective on that because she was watching it. But it seems that, I mean, there were dues paid. I mean, there were jobs. There were a couple of jobs that Louise had that she lost because of political affiliation and whatnot. But I don't have the details on the everyday, like what was going on an everyday basis. I know from talking with, I know some things like from talking with Esther Cooper Jackson, and she was telling me about, you know, she lived next to Doxy Wilkerson. And so there were a number of things they did, signals and different things like that. But why? I don't know if I don't know. She could have been, she wasn't the target for some reason that maybe she could have been. And Mary Louise probably has a better perspective on that. I'm not quite sure of how she worked the day to day and how she got through it on a day to day basis.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I was always aware, but the household seemed to be a stable household to me. They maintained a stable household to me, for me and for themselves. But I don't know at what sacrifice, you know, because clearly I was not I was not privy to a lot of discussions, perhaps on how they were doing that. As I said, Louise was the breadwinner, and although she did lose her job at the United Nations, she was working at an NGO. Herbert Aptheker wanted to start the American Institute for Marxist Studies, and Louise worked for him. And I think she, you know, whatever he could pay her, he paid her. That sustained us, as well as we always had someone living with us at the time. Bia was living with us for a lot of the time. Bia lived with us. And then my father's sister-in-law lived with us, so that there were shared expenses, I guess. I'm sure they paid, part of their stay, paid for part of their stay in the house, so that it made it possible for all of us to maintain a stable, what appeared to be a stable life. I grew up eating, again, I'm going to personalize it, particularly for the young woman who asked. We ate tongue and cow's tongue and cow's liver. Had brains and eggs for breakfast, cow's brains and eggs for breakfast. Some of y'all may just be raising eyebrows and what I'm talking about. But these were foods these were parts of the animal that were discards, really. And, now if you try to buy cow tongue, it's prohibitive. But back then it was a discard. We ate pig's feet. There was never a time when there was no food in the house. But what I'm trying to say is that we didn't eat high on the hog most of the time. But we were okay, and the lights were never turned off in our house. So again, I think it was cobbling together on the part of my parents, sharing expenses, not only just the two of them, but other people who lived with us during that period. I think those other people, the presence of those other people also helped sustain them psychologically and emotionally. They had themselves, but they also had two other people to interact with besides me. So you build community. You have to build community. You can't fight this struggle by yourself. You have to build community and figure out a way how to sustain yourself. And one other point I just want to make quickly is my father placed a tremendous emphasis on personal health and well-being. He jumped rope every morning, as I mentioned. He felt it was the responsibility of a revolutionary to take care of himself or herself. It wasn't just selfish. It wasn't just because you were selfish about yourself, but it was because you had a responsibility to the revolution to be well, to be healthy, to be able to carry it out. And so you had to do what you needed to do in order to be healthy.
He lived to 89 or 90, right?
That's right. That's right. And would have lived longer, except that he had an operation and developed a clot from his lung that went into from his leg into his lungs, and he died from that. But had he not had that operation, he would have gone on and lived, another 10 years at least. So that's one answer to the question. The other part of that question was
advice for the young activists.
Okay,
about voting.
I think the other thing I would say was my parents were, as I said, you can't fight this battle by yourself. The enemy, as we can see today, is well organized, well financed, and on the march. So we have to link arms. We have to put away, it seems to me, our petty differences and save the planet and save those of us that are on it. So I think unity and looking for unity, not unity without principle, obviously unity with principles, but unity. And the greater the unity and the deeper the unity, the better for all of us. And I don't know, there was another part of that question, but I don't remember what it was.
I think there was a critique of voting, or there was something you could restate that.
Yeah, it is brief, and you feel free whatever you want to say, but it was advice for young Black women radicals organizing for justice, especially in the quote unquote progressive spaces that support Black votes but not Black liberation. So critiquing sort of
Well, I think you have to. I mean, I agree with Mary Louise. I mean, people power is what we have. We don't have. You don't have the resources that that the other side has. But I don't. I think we have to adopt more of a both and strategy when we can, when feasible. So I don't think it is this against the vote or whatever. I think you use all tools. I think you use all tools that you can use. The vote does certain things for you. Voting matters because if you put certain people in places, that won't be a total liberation, but you can hold them accountable for certain things. They're less likely to do things than do other things, So voting matters. I don't think you can discount that, but I think you have to have a multi-pronged both and strategy, which would be in line with how Louise moved. She did things. I know Mike Gold used to tease her when she was working for the IWO, and he would say, "Hey, Louise, you still working for that bourgeois insurance organization?" And Mike Gold was broken, but Louise went on and did what she did because her work in that organization made some tangible difference in the lives of some of those workers and participants in IWO. And so I think you have a both and strategy. I think multi-pronged would be the way they did it. I see Louise. I mean, she was in the party, but I also see her as part of an independent Black left as well. So it wasn't only party doctrine that she followed, but she followed her heart and the things that made sense to her in terms of organizing.
Thank you so much. So I want just a very brief one sentence answer to this very last question so we can close and y'all can get some sleep or finish your dinner or whatnot. So Louise was involved in many struggles throughout her entire life, 97 years, am I correct on that?
Mm-hmm. Almost 98.
98, okay.
Oh, just about 98.
All right.
She saw the whole 20th century just about.
So everything.
Actually, almost 99, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you were to choose, from your studies of her life growing up as her daughter, choose one struggle from both of your perspectives that meant the most to her, what would it be? And just very brief, because we're over time and I don't want to hold y'all too much longer. So, but I just want to close on kind of this note, see like what we can learn from, right? And what meant a lot to her.
I would say the Scottsboro struggle. But that's a hard question to answer because all of them, really. She gave her heart to the Angela.
Scottsboro's big. Spain was big for her. She wore herself out speaking on behalf of the Republican cause in Spain. Scottsboro was definitely, I would say Scottsboro was big. She actually, I don't know if people know the story, but the actual, one of the accusers, the original accusers in the Scottsboro case actually stayed with Louise.
Yes.
She actually stayed with her when she recanted her testimony and stuff like that. So she actually marched with her in 1933 at the Scottsboro demonstration. Yeah.
That was Ruby Bates.
Ruby Bates, yeah. So Scottsboro, Scottsboro, Spain.
And then Angela.
Angela was big.
And Sojourners. Sojourners and Angela.
Yeah.
So now they're four.
I would say Chicago. I say don't count the Chicago. Those Chicago years were very important.
Yeah.
And even she kept. I mean, if you look at some of the footage on her later, I mean, when she was at home in Oakland, she'd be surrounded by newspapers and magazines and all kinds. She just wanted to keep up on everything. She weighed in on The Color Purple. She talked. Maya Angelou would go to see her, and they discussed that. And Maya said, "Well," and Louise said, "Well, tell me what they say when you go to New York to the conference," and stuff like that. She, Nikki Finney worked with her. It's so much. It's just a lot. It's a lot. Yeah. I figure if you're gonna live 99 years, you may as well do something. So she did.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much. This has been a beautiful, beautiful conversation. I wish we had more time. I can see Dr. Gilly's getting a little tired over there. So.
Oh, God.
I'm just getting started.
Yes.
Mary Louise got the motor.
No, thank you both so much. I'm like so enamored by both of you. Just hopefully we can do this again, but thank you so much for just talking about the life, leadership, and legacy of Louise Thompson Patterson. So we learned so much. Thank you again.
Sojourners.
Yeah. Sojourners.
All right, gotcha. Thank you very much, man. Love you, Mary Lou. Take care.
Yeah, you too, Key.
All right.
Thank you so much, y'all. Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.